And I would now like to introduce our next speaker. She has a very long bio. She's done a lot of really wonderful things, but we shortened it. And so Celinda Lake is a well-known, highly respected pollster and strategist. Her firm, Lake Research Partners, conducts extensive polling, including on how audiences view domestic and sexual violence. Her staff came to Santa Fe for our membership meeting, I think it was last year, they run together, to present what they learned about how messages are playing, our messages with a general audience. And I have to say we weren't always happy with what we heard because we realized that what we were saying, the messages we were putting out, were not necessarily those that were resonating. That's why we knew it was so important to have her back. We need to know how our usual messages are falling short and what we can do about it. And so with that, the wonderful Celinda Lake. Thank you.
Well, thank you very, very much. It's great to be here, and it's wonderful to be in New Mexico. I'm from Montana. Where are my fellow Montanans here? Are they here yet? Maybe they're sleeping. But it's really wonderful to be here, and wonderful to be working with you all. I also want to say that the research that we are doing is very much a work in progress. And I want you to be part of that progress. So this is not meant in any way to be the definitive work here. What this is meant to be is, whoops, now, let's see. I think we need someone to come and load up the presentation. There we go. This is meant very much to be the beginning point. There's also tremendous diversity within community here. And it was so powerful, I think, your introduction to look at the diversity in the Native American community. And I want to tell you that thank you very much. But the presentation needs to be loaded too. Thanks. One of the things that is my hope is that this research can be broadened to look in depth at the Native American community, which we were not able to do at the first, in the first presentation. No, this isn't the presentation, sorry. Here comes I always say IT is it. Here comes the IT guy to save us. Oh, he's IT too. Well, two its. How can you do any better than that? So anyway, we want very much to broaden the research here. And already, and I want to thank the generosity of the Novo Foundation for funding this research. Already there's a second wave of research, but trying to look at the differences by different communities, trying to take different pieces of the problem. So this first research was a goal to, thank you so much, to just look at what is the lay of the land. And the first thing I wanted to start out with in terms of lay of the land is just what kind of, there we go, what kind of atmosphere you're involved in. So let's look first at the purpose of this initial research. And again, I really want to underscore that this was initial research, looking at the very first take on this in a long time, and then building on that. So it was to examine frames that promote and advance the value of women and girls. And we started out with, I think, a commitment that many of us in this room share, that we want this to be embedded in a broader dialogue, and that indeed, until we change the soil that all of our trees are planted in, we won't achieve our goals in this issue area or any of the issue areas. We wanted to explore what people perceive to be the root causes of violence, and we wanted to talk to people about the actions that they would be willing to take to help end violence in this context, in today's world, nationally and at their communities. Now, some of these things were successful. We got some good look at frames, and I think some powerful frames, but they're the beginning of the conversation. We don't have to be just where the voters are. What we want to do, or the people are, what we want to do is take and understand where people are and then move them forward. But it's important, if we're going to move them forward, to meet them where they're at and to understand where they're at, not with the goal of settling for where they're at, but with the goal of engaging in this conversation in a meaningful way to move them in the direction that we want. Secondly, we find that sometimes our successes are defined by our rousing failures. How many have had a success that was heavily influenced by a rousing failure? I know I have. There you go. So some of these things you'll see that will be near and dear to your heart, near and dear to my heart, weren't very successful. And it's important to understand that and why that was. And then decide, can we give that up? Fine, we don't need that component of message. Or is it important for us to therefore understand how do we educate people about that? And then the biggest question, and you must feel this every day, was the biggest challenge for us was people thought they were with us completely. In fact, as the movie said a long time ago, we had them at hello. People thought they were there from the get-go. They had been committed to domestic violence forever in their community. They gave to the United Way Drive. They gave to the Safe House. So the hardest problem we have, and we didn't, frankly, really figure out what to do, was to get people off of the couch. How could we get people to take action in this area, to prioritize it in terms of budget? Because one of the things we found is people were remarkably tax sensitive about domestic violence. Now, people are sensitive about taxes, period, right now, because people are short of money. And certainly you feel that in New Mexico. But having said that, this is just really not that much money. Come on. You're going to be worried about what violence against women and girls programs are spending, but you're not worried about what Halliburton is spending in Iraq. I mean, this makes no sense. That and that tax sensitivity, which was pretty shocking, honestly, including among communities of color who traditionally aren't as tax sensitive, that's something we got to figure out here and overcome. But the biggest problem was we had to figure out how do we get people off of the couch. In the messaging component, we tested social math, we tested perceived causes of violence, and we tested a variety of messages. And by the way, a lot of this research very influenced by a whole cohort of leaders internationally and nationally, including some of your great leaders from New Mexico, were involved in helping to develop these messages. Social math is where sometimes, a couple of things I would say just by way of basic message instruction. And you're going to get some of the best message instruction later on this afternoon from a number of people in the field. But one of the things I would say to you is leave your acronyms at home. If you're talking in alphabets, don't do it. Break yourself of that habit immediately. Secondly, we always think that the facts are the most important thing, right? If we just tell people the facts, they'll be with us. Well, to our great disappointment in our business, what we know is that facts honestly aren't very important, and that in fact, facts are important for you all, but not for real people. You're not real, right? Because no one would be in a room without windows on a day like today if you were real. So, in New Mexico, I might add, and with the ability to go visit the Pueblo, I mean, we would have left immediately after that. In fact, Anat and I were debating, should we leave right now or do we have to stay for our presentations? You're not real, so facts matter to you. But in our business, we say that when the facts don't fit the frame, people don't reject the frame, they reject the facts. And the best example of that is climate change and global warming. If you want to, there are 999 scientists and they're one scientist, and people think the world is divided on this issue. So obviously the facts don't matter. Social math is an example. Sometimes there's a statistic that is so powerful that it becomes a metaphor. So we were looking for social math here. The best example I can give you of social math is an example of research that we worked on with Kathy Bach, who I see here, who I think you'll have a chance to interact with later. And it was about gun control in California and changing the laws for gun dealers. And we said at the time there were 16 times more gun dealers in California than McDonald's. And people thought, oh my God, there's a McDonald's on every corner. You mean I passed 16 gun dealers on the way to get my Big Mac? That's astounding. And people even got the stat wrong. They said there were 6 times more instead of 16. But the idea was it was a metaphor. We didn't find really powerful statistics in this area. This is not an area that's moved particularly by facts and statistics, to be honest with you. It's an area moved more by values and personal experience and the connecting to that personal experience. But as you know, that personal experience can be energizing or disempowering. It can lead people to individual intervention, but not necessarily systemic intervention. And so there's a lot of dilemma. You'd think, man, how could this movement be in trouble on their messages? You got all this personal experience. Well, that personal experience can lead to as much demobilization and burnout as it leads to mobilization. And that's true at the activist level as well as at the personal level. So we started out the research with focus groups, which are small group discussions, and tried to get some variety among that, although noticeably missing, obviously, the Native American community, which we would really love to pursue in the future. And then we did a quite large nationwide survey where every group was included, but the ability to look at certain groups individually depended on the budget size. So let's look at 3 different things. One, what are the trends that are going on out there in terms of the message environment in which you're working in? 2, what did we find in terms of messages? And then 3, what are the recommendations for the future? So first of all, people are spending less and less time getting information and less time particularly getting political information. In fact, cynicism about politics is at an all-time high, and people think their Congress and their state legislature gets very little done. And people are really not getting new information. They tend more to get existing information that they have reinforced by their existing networks. The 30-second soundbite is now 9 seconds. So when you go home tonight or in the hotel room tonight, try to explain your program or give your message in 9 seconds, because that's how much time you have. In the last election, 2012, which people thought was a pretty important election, the average swing voter, the average person who hadn't made up their mind beforehand, spent 15 minutes total gathering information on who to vote for. So if people spend 15 minutes to decide who is going to be the leader of the free world, I don't think they're going to spend 15 minutes on your program. So that means, again, we are down to a couple of minutes' time in an entire year. We're down to fleetingly grab people's attention while they're immersed in everything else, and we're down to a 9-second soundbite. 2 things about information. The first thing is people still rely primarily on TV. Now, we can talk about social media, and it's very, very important, but still people rely primarily on television. And the unfortunate thing about New Mexico is this is a state where people rely even more on television than your average state. So this is less of a social media state than your average state, in part because it's a little bit older population. Women, who tend to be a real target for us, are relying on friends and family. Now, the problem is that a lot of people, frankly, need new friends and family. And a lot of people's social networks are dominated by crazy Uncle Joe who only listens to Fox. And a lot of women don't want to pass on information that they think would be divisive. Crazy Uncle Joe, how many people have a crazy Uncle Joe? Yeah, he doesn't mind dive-bombing Thanksgiving dinner and everything in between and saying the most outrageous things that you know are not true. But do you engage crazy Uncle Joe? Well, maybe you do, but most of the family just lets him go. And doesn't your mother or your sister say to you, please don't engage him at Thanksgiving dinner, okay? Don't divide the family. So crazy Uncle Joe gets away with it all. So we need, presuming that we don't have the money to change people's friends and family, we need to get people embedded in these networks to pass on the information, the messages that we have. A third change that's going on there that is actually more powerful for us is demographic change. The rising American electorate, or the emerging American electorate, which is voters under 30, unmarried people, including unmarried women, and people of color, are very fast becoming a majority of the country. Now, you've seen some very fast and long-term demographic changes in New Mexico to begin with. But the rising American electorate is changing nationwide, and 2016 will be the first election where half of the people, half the voters, right now, half of America's rising American electorate, but in 2016 will be the first electorate where half of the voters are the rising American electorate. And they have very different orientations to the role of women and men, to the role of government, and those end up being two very important pieces. By the way, you can get all of these slides, so if I'm going a little fast, don't worry about getting the information. You can get it afterwards. So here are the overlapping circles, but you can see here we're talking about a lot of different kinds of people. 55 million unmarried women, 23 million Latinos, 45.6 million people under 30, 26.9 million African Americans, 14.7 million Asian American Pacific Islanders and Native Americans and Alaska Natives in our country. So huge, huge numbers of people in the rising American electorate. Now, I think New Mexico can be the lead, and you all can be the lead, because you've been used to a much, much richer dialogue than most of your sisters and brothers in other states have been. Unmarried births. This is a huge, huge issue for us. In 1980, 18% of births were to unmarried moms. Today, actually, we've got the most updated number. It's now 44%. And in fact, among young people under 30, 50% of births are to unmarried moms. In 6 years, half of every kindergarten class is going to be made up of unmarried moms. Now, we can think whatever we want about that, good or bad. I had a Republican pollster friend who said, I don't mind you giving the statistics, but why are you celebrating it? And it's like, Ed, I don't have an opinion either way. I'm not celebrating or not. But as we say in Montana, those horses are out of the barn. You can't put those kids back in utero and say, wait until you get married to have that child. We can't change human gestation to the gestation of an elephant. So those horses are out of the barn. And you can see here the numbers by race. Every single race and ethnic group has huge numbers, 53% of Hispanics, 66% of American Indian and Alaska Native, and 72% of births to African Americans are to single moms. We haven't got any of our structures in our society. There aren't employers, social support networks, education networks, our legal system. Nothing is ready for this in our country. This is a sea change, and it has very profound implications, I think, for some of the kinds of programming that you all are doing. The rising American electorate, much, much more supportive of a role of government. So you see the challenge here in New Mexico. New Mexico is kind of ground zero for people feeling, on the one hand, there should be a role for government. On the other hand, we don't want to pay very much for that role. The rising American electorate, much, much more supportive of a role for government than the traditional electorate. But notice it doesn't take very long for attitudes to shift. Voters under 30, 54% say the government and the private sector should be concerned. The government, not the private sector, should be concerned about solving the country's social programs. But you hit 30, and only 27% of people agree with that. So how many people in this room under 30? Do we want to admit it? There you go. Okay, well, we got to double that number next conference, right? Because, and we got to get out and talk to our friends and family, because we got some attitudes to change, those of us who are not under 30. This may be the most astounding statistic. So the father of the family must be the master of his own house. How many people in the room believe that? I'll protect you. Okay. 49% of married men believe that in this country. 31% of unmarried women, because it includes widows, believe that. Only a quarter of married women believe it. So maybe this is why our divorce rate is 50%. But we've got some really deep-rooted traditional attitudes. The difference between the RAE and the non-rising American electorate. Views about just social issues. Planned Parenthood, 64% favorable among the rising American electorate, only 44% favorable among the non-rising American electorate. Who doesn't like Planned Parenthood? Except some really crazy right-wingers. Marriage equality. And of course, New Mexico moved in a major way on this issue. Congratulations. But notice the difference. Only 30% of the rising American electorate against it, 44% of the non-rising American electorate. The Tea Party, 44% of the rising American electorate negative on the Tea Party, 39% of non-RAE negative about the Tea Party. So some major, major differences in terms of social issues. The other demographic trend is it's up to the women. Now, I must say, I am really excited about the number of men in this room. And I have addressed a lot of conferences in the last year, and there is more male representation here. And I want to celebrate our men who support this effort than I have seen in a lot of other states. That said, among the voters, it is really astounding the difference in terms of core attitudes between men and women, and the differences in terms of if one of our problems is getting people off the couch, it's going to be the women who are going to get off the couch on this issue first. Both are solidly on the couch right now, but it's going to take a while to get the men off the couch. Women, much, much more likely to be empathetic. I have a personal responsibility to help those worse off than myself. 42% of women say that. Now, that's 42%, not 52%, not 62%. So we got a ways to go here. But only 27% of men think that I have a personal responsibility to help those worse off than myself. I like to put myself in another person's shoes and try to imagine how I would have felt in his or her place. 40% of women say that's true. Again, 40, not 50, not 60, only 40, but only 29% of men agree with that. So when we're talking about empathy, when we're talking about putting ourselves in someone else's shoes, that is a largely female dialogue, and even there, it's all too limited. The last overall trend that we're seeing is that the economy and jobs, which people still think is in bad shape, is pushing everything else out. It's really hard to get people's attention on anything else. Now, you're activists, and here's what voters think about you. Voters think, first of all, you're like Henny Penny. You like to worry about lots of things. Real people do not like to worry about lots of things. Real people already have lots of things on their mind, and they like to get some things off their minds. So they think you play a great role. You're Henny Penny, you say the sky is falling all the time, that's good, but nobody would listen to you all the time. I mean, that would be downright depressing and exhausting. We asked people, what do you think it would be like to go to dinner with activists? And there was a big pause in the room. You've already had people say this to you, huh? And people said, well, it would be very interesting. They would talk very fast. I would eat food I had never eaten before. It would be exhausting, and I would only want to do it once. So remember, real people only want to go to dinner with you once in their entire lifetime, which means that 9-second soundbite is pretty damn important. But real people are totally dominated by their concern about the economy, and it's pushing everything else out. And you can see here, violence against girls and women, 3% of the people worried about violence against girls and women. Now, only 2% worried about Afghanistan, where we're spending all the money we could spend to deal with the violence against girls and women. So you're not the only thing pushed out, but the economy really dominates, and it's very, very hard right now to get people's attention. People are worried about economic security and economic stability. And a majority of people think the economy got worse in the last 4 years, not better. So it is, by any margin, a tough environment out there. And you may well say, why did you start in the morning with her? And why you need to have alcohol served when you're hearing her talk. And it doesn't get a whole lot better for a while, so brace yourself. I won't be offended if anyone wants to go out and get coffee. So real people believe that there are two primary causes of violence against girls and women: drug, alcohol abuse, and addiction. And men are particularly likely to hold that view. And cycle of violence learned in childhood and then passed on to the next generation. And women are particularly likely to hold this view. People also think A lack of parenting resonates as a root cause. So what's the problem with this list? The problem with this list is that people feel very disempowered by this list. So their explanations lead them not to take action. Many, many, many people have experience with drug, alcohol abuse, and addiction in their families. And what that has taught them is until the person is ready to make a change, I can't do anything about it. Now, we could have a whole 2-day seminar on that. We also know many, many people who have alcohol and drug problems who are not violent. So we would have major questions with this explanation to begin with. But the point is, this is men's top explanation, and it's a disempowering explanation. Lack of parenting. People are very, very concerned about lack of parenting. But they also believe, how can I intervene in other people's lack of parenting? I can't do anything about that. It means that they tend to concentrate on programs in the schools because they do think, okay, well, that's where I can make up for it. But again, a totally important explanation. And God knows what America is going to conclude about parenting, because America still believes that a child is best raised by a mother and a father. Now, we can also have major conversations about that, but the point of the matter is, in a world where half of the children are going to be the children of single moms, and there still may be a father involved in that child, but these norms are going to be really tested in the next decade. And who knows what America's going to conclude about parenting in that circumstance. And then cycles of violence. There are some ways to intervene in cycles of violence, but people don't know how to get in early enough. They don't know what they can do about that. And you'll see some interesting issues. This is the place where people imagine there might be some public intervention that would be effective, but people have no idea what that would look like. They're not sure what they would do. So here you see the data, and so this tells you the number of people that say it's primary or somewhat a root cause. Look at the dark pink, because that's the people that say this is a primary cause. That's where you get intensity. And you can see there are only 3 things that really have real intensity to them: drug and alcohol abuse, cycles of violence, and lack of parenting. Men not raised to respect women, and low self-esteem among girls. Secondary explanations for people with not a lot of intensity. Many of us would head right there. That's, for many of us, that is a primary motivator, a primary explanation, a primary thing that we want to deal with. But we've got only a third of the public intensely on board with us on that. Other things that are very important to us, clearly not even rising to the level of intensity that would cause people to act. So the way that girls and women are depicted in the media, video games and music, socioeconomic status, no intensity to those at all. Things that people think downright aren't explanations. Girls and women not valued in our society. How many people in this room think that's an important thing that we need to change? Okay, well, that's why people aren't having dinner with us, because they don't agree with us on that. Lack of opportunity for girls and women. How many people say, this is a major motivator for me? Yeah. So this is why we need message work, and this is why we need Message Matters, because we are starting at fundamentally different places than the public is standing. Now, that doesn't mean we want to settle for this. It just means we need to understand it to figure out how are we going to overcome this. The second thing we looked at is language, and language is both our friend and our enemy. And you're going to hear from one of the best people on language later on, and ways to think about things, Annette Shanker. So be sure and buy her book, which says don't buy it, but don't believe that, buy it, about the economy. But language is extremely important. Language is both a plus and a minus for us in this area, because we have some very hot words that work for us. Unfortunately, the hot words lead people to think about immediate direct intervention rather than long-term programming. And the 2 hot words here are abuse and rape. Now, if you want to motivate people and get people to do something immediately, or give you a $25 contribution every month, using the words rape and abuse are very, very strong words. But they are exhausting to the community. They are burnout for the community, and it doesn't change the long-term soil that we're planting those trees in. So we have hot language that works for us. Many movements would love to have some hot language that work for them. But this language is as much our enemy as our friend. And it drowns out the other things we want to say. Once we say abuse and rape, it's like, no, 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 I can't hear anything more. So the language works for us, but it's like the crack of our movement, right? It works for us in the short run, but is addictive and makes it hard to sustain the movement internally, hard to get the movement to where we really want it to be externally. So messages resonate at a core value level, and I think a number of our speakers are going to talk about this and the fact that and how to get messaging to work in terms of at the core values level. We found 3 messages that were really strong. One was human rights, and I was flabbergasted at this. We put human rights in the messaging because the community that was involved in helping to develop this, the leadership cohort, really felt compelled by human rights dialogue. I honestly didn't think it would work very well because human rights is not normally testing very well, but it tested really well here. Right versus wrong, and using education to prevent violence. The last message, very important, because we can get people all fired up, but then we have to get them to take some action. And often getting them all fired up means they feel less empowered rather than more empowered. Human rights, living a life free of violence is a basic right for everyone, and it goes against our values when girls and women are beaten and raped. All girls and women deserve the basic rights and fundamental freedoms of life, liberty, safety, and respect. And when these rights are violated, we have a duty to help. No one should be subject to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment and violence against girls and women. It's an extreme human rights violation that must be stopped. Again, flabbergasted, honestly, that this worked, but it was a very strong message. We have a majority of the people finding it very convincing, and almost universal value finding it convincing. Right versus wrong. When we talk about violence against girls and women, it really comes down to right versus wrong. When girls and women are beaten and raped, when they're killed or forced into prostitution just to survive, it violates what we believe in. We are taught that you stand up for the vulnerable and fight injustice, even when it's hard. Violence against girls and women is not consistent with our values and not what our country stands for. And finally, our education system plays an important role in preventing violence against girls and women. Schools are uniquely positioned to promote better attitudes and behavior among young people and to help girls who are suffering or vulnerable. We need to educate boys to not turn to violence and to respect girls, and we need to educate girls to value themselves. Boys and girls who are empowered through this kind of education are less likely to engage in violence or to think violence is acceptable. We all know schools have a lot to deal with, so as a community, we should support them in their role in ending violence. Schools was a place that people thought they could intervene. People also thought this issue much more likely for them to do something at the community level than the national level. And people thought that human rights and moral values and our values centered in all of these messages. So these messages were quite strong. A second tier of messages that were good but not great were personal conversations, community impact. These, however, were very important with certain communities of color. Every last girl and engaging men and boys. Some messages that didn't work. Trying to make this a health issue did not work. Talking about women's rights as opposed to human rights. And we're really stunned to see this differentiation. But people made a 15-point differentiation between human rights and women's rights. And then talking about the little things that matter, sexist language, homophobic language. Unfortunately, people thought, no, this is big, and that is little, and that is not where it starts. The human rights language, particularly strong with whites and African Americans. Education, very strong with Latinos. Latinos really love the education message. Making it personal, also strong in the Latino community. And talking very strong in the African American community. Now, there are elements of other messages, and you can look at them, that you probably loved. But the problem is, if we've got 9 seconds, and people are only going to spend maybe 2 minutes on us the whole year, we all have to repeat the same messages. So while there are lots of good things to say, we have to, as a community, decide, and as a movement, decide on what are our messages and really repeat them if we're going to have any impact. The second thing is targeting messages by community can be very effective. And I'm not even going to talk at length about that because I think in New Mexico, you all are really expert on that. You really already have done that for a very long time and built that into your programs. Social math, not too important because numbers didn't matter. If we were going to use numbers, 40% of teenage girls ages 14 to 7 say they know someone their own age who has been hit or beaten by a boyfriend. At least 1 in 3 girls is sexually abused by the time they reach 18. Those were the two strongest statistics. But take that, excuse me, take that to the state legislature. Don't take that necessarily to the public. Values far more important and what you can do about it than the statistics. But these are shock and awe statistics, and they can play a role in terms of getting a newscaster's attention or getting a state legislator's attention. Let me ask, I just didn't realize it. I thought, boy, it's been 9 o'clock for a long time. My watch has stopped. Who's my timer? Ah, great. Oh, thank you. Great. Time flies when you're having fun, but this time wasn't going moving at all. In terms of statistics vary by community. African Americans respond to the frequency of sexual assault. African Americans also, by the way, more likely to take this issue to the voting booth. And African Americans really respond to the idea of anti-violence curriculum and having conversations with girls and boys. Latinos responding to the 1 in 3 sexual assault statistic, much more likely to be involved at community than national level, and much more likely to be influenced when you made it personal as well as political. We talked about ending violence and preventing violence. Preventing makes people more proactive. People like to be in prevention. They were worried that you could really end it. They were somewhat skeptical that you could end it. But both ways of talking about it were pretty powerful. People did say that they would vote the issue, both reward a candidate who was good on it and punish a candidate who was bad on it. But there wasn't a lot of intensity to it. And frankly, people are skeptical that anyone is really bad on domestic violence issues. They tend to think that who wouldn't be good? There must have been a reason why everybody talks about this. This is a bipartisan issue. Why wouldn't everybody be good on it? People were also remarkably tax sensitive. So we asked people, would you be likely to vote for a candidate who supported ending violence against women and girls? And 55% of the voters said, yes, I would, and be more likely. Only 28% much more likely. But when we said, even if it raised your taxes, people dropped dramatically down to 35%. 35% is not an issue that's going to scare any candidate out there. And same kind of thing on punishing a candidate or on preventing violence, 57 to 38. People are unbelievably tax sensitive on this issue. They think they can do this issue on the cheap. They think, wait a minute, I already gave to the Safe House, United Way gives to them, how much does this cost? The schools already exist, so how much can this, let's just distribute the pamphlet at school, how much can that cost? People are dramatically tax sensitive on this issue in a very, very disheartening way. People also tend to think that this is an issue that's better at the community level than the national level. And, you know, frankly, that's probably good for us anyway, because you all are community-based. But it's also hard to get people to prioritize it at the state level. And I commend your governor for having prioritized it. But people move it to their community level. And they believe they'll be more effective. And they also believe that, that they can intervene personally more at the community level. Now, after people heard all of our messaging, they moved pretty dramatically in favor of national involvement as well as community involvement. But people thought overwhelmingly that it's at the community level that you're going to make the most difference. Men particularly thought that, and African Americans and Latinos particularly thought that. Finally, what actions were people willing to take? Way too few is the bottom line. People would reach out to authorities or speak up if they saw someone inflicting violence, although I think we all know the complications of that in real life. But people perceive themselves to be willing to do that. After that, it's pretty skimpy, because remember, we'd like to have 50% of the people in the bright pink numbers, and we don't have that. The top thing is funding an anti-violence curriculum for schools, donating money to an organization that works against violence by working with girls, boys, women, and men. And by the way, people really like the idea of bringing men and boys in, and they really like the curriculum in a school to involve the boys. What they wouldn't be very willing to do, anything to do with the media. And that's really startling. People just don't think they can have any impact on the media, and they're not too eager to write their member of Congress or their state legislator. Now, part of that is they're not too eager to talk to those guys about anything anyway. And they believe that their letter will be filed in the circular file immediately. Latinos, less tax sensitive, but more easier to disempower. Latinos, less likely to take action, less tax sensitive. So, what are our recommendations? Leave your statistics at home, focus on values and message. You have hot language, but it's a plus and a minus. Talk about men not respecting women rather than girls and women not being valued. Lack of opportunities for girls and women doesn't resonate. Doesn't mean we stop there, but this is where we're starting. We can talk about ending or preventing violence, although people really love the prevention word. We need to focus on values rather than cost to society. Cost to society, by the way, did not motivate people very much. And we need to practice message discipline. We've got 3 good messages. They can be improved on enormously. Let's work together to improve them, but let's not spread our messaging all over the place. We got to hone in and repeat, because we've got 9 seconds and we've got 2 minutes in the entire next year. So thank you for all you do. Hopefully that's helpful, and I'm delighted to take questions in a couple of minutes of questions. And you'll keep us on time. So, questions or comments? I can probably hear you. Question here and then a question right here. And I'll repeat the question.
This is interesting about what people already believe and
Right.
reinforcing. But what if we want to change what they think?
That's right.
So what's the strategy there?
Yeah, really good idea. So the first thing, the question was, this is what people think today. What if we want to change what people think? So first of all, you can't change a person's opinion if you don't know where they start. So the first thing is to clear where do they start. Then there are things that people believe today that we all share and really work, and I think are very powerful to us as well. Certainly their resonance with the human rights message, the responses that people think this is a moral right and wrong, the resonance that people have with prevention and getting in early in education. Those are powerful things. So we ought to use those today. And then as a community, I think we have to evaluate what are the things we want people to believe that are essential. Do we need to move on? So there are, let's just get 2 examples, right? One example was the cost to society broadly did not work very well as a message because, frankly, people were already beyond that. They didn't have to be told in dollars and cents. They were for the human rights message. And even when we talked about the cost to society, it didn't make them any less tax sensitive. Well, I don't think we're, and I'm not living and dying because I think this is the cost to society. I think it's just wrong. I'm motivated by the values piece. So fine, let's abandon it. We don't, take the report into the state legislature because it does matter there, but we don't need to change people's attitudes about that. I think many of us wouldn't believe that was essential to why we're here or to making that ground more healthy for those trees. It was kind of an instrumental argument to begin with. On the other hand, the lack of opportunities for girls and self-esteem, that's very powerful, right? We need to change that attitude. The whole, I would believe, personally I believe, the whole issue of alcohol and the relationship of alcohol and drugs is something we need to change because there are a lot of people it isn't 100% correlation. Give me a break. And probably 100% of the people who are involved in domestic violence drink coffee and tea too. And are we saying coffee leads to domestic violence? No. We gotta change that attitude. So I think we gotta figure out which of these things do we want to change because we believe they're essential to creating that soil, a healthy soil, or because it's leading people in the wrong direction. And which of those things can we abandon? And then the next step of research is to figure out how do we link to what people are already believing to make them respond to the things that we believe are essential to change. Question here?
I'm sorry if you already said this. This research was done on people in New Mexico, or was
No,
this national?
I don't think I did say it. It was a nationwide survey, and not on people in New Mexico. And man, would it be interesting to do it here because you are so unique. I mean, every state says they're unique, but you actually are unique. So New Jersey's honestly not that unique, but they like to think they are. But you really are unique. And so it would be great to replicate this here, but this was nationwide work.
And I'm just curious, did you see differences in different regions?
Not that much broadly. They couldn't, excuse me, that couldn't be explained by demographic differences. But that doesn't mean that New Mexico might not have its own attitudes.
I run a nonprofit in Kentucky that focuses on engaging men and boys. And I don't have it's not hard data, but our experiential data suggests that using our promotional messages is significantly more effective than using our prevention messages.
Oh,
So
interesting.
what I mean is in trying
give
to
an
engage
example
men and
of each.
boys, if we talk about promoting, if we're reaching out to men and boys and we're saying, we're talking about promoting gender respect, we're talking about promoting human rights, if we're talking about what we are working
Yeah.
towards,
Yeah.
our men in Kentucky are much more likely to come on board and say, yes, I want to be a part of that. Then when we say, do you want to be a part of preventing rape? or
Oh,
preventing
that's
abuse?
fascinating.
And I'd be really interested in, have you all looked at that, or has it been
We
primarily
did
the
not, but that would be
abuse?
a really fun thing to look at in the future. When you look at these messages, the last one is prevention, but the first two are more promotional by your definition of promotional. So I think, that's somewhat consistent here for the public broadly to act. But it is women that are women and Latinos that are most motivated by the prevention message. So that's somewhat consistent with your findings. But that would be great to look at in the future and a really good thing to take away.
I'm interested in the use of the word the electorate, the rising American electorate.
Yeah.
My experience working with younger people outside of our movement is they're not going to vote. They are not interested.
That's
they
right.
don't want to. So I'd like you to speak to the use of that word and what it actually means when you say the electorate.
Well, really good question. So we use the word electorate. This survey that Novo did and the work that they did here was to serve many masters. And so one of the masters was some of the groups were involved in lobbying their state legislatures, and they want to take these numbers to politicians. Well, politicians only care about voters. And so that's why we made it voters. I would never use the word electorate broadly. And the next round of research we're going to do actually is going to include some of the electorate and some of the people who aren't in the electorate. Because I think all of us know experientially that some of the people most motivated and willing to take action in this area are not voters. And, solving the voting problem is one whole thing, but we don't have to adopt that as our problem. But this was serving many masters, and one of them was to take data into state legislators, and they only care about voters. So that's why we did it. But don't use the word electorate, and we shouldn't think of ourselves as only limited to electorate. One last question, I think. Way in the back, Kim? Oh, no, I'm sorry. However, maybe two quick questions.
I'm up. Hi, Celinda. My name is Kelson Young. I'm from Montana. And I just
Yay.
wanted to tell you that we're very proud
I
of
was
you in
looking
Montana.
for you. Thank you.
Many people have asked some of the questions I had, but I guess a slightly different take is in Montana, as you know, we have support from men, but it's from a very sort of paternalistic
Yeah.
position. And so just any feedback you have about messaging and engaging men, but dealing with that paternalistic.
Yeah, it's a great question. And it was one of the things that I really don't have an answer, because it was one of the things that we identified in this work that was problematic. It wasn't so problematic in the data. So men responded, for example, very strongly to the human rights message. But boy, when we got in the focus groups, it was one of the toughest groups I've ever watched in my life. And I've watched a lot of them. But it was very paternalistic, and I think it's something to think about together. And frankly, the overall conclusion here was that in terms of the short run of this, and this was just the first piece of research, and there's a 10-year commitment by Novo every 2 years to try to do some research that will help the movement, and obviously lots of research in lots of other places going on as well. But the goal here is, the need is enormous to really go in and explore this more in depth with men, because even the messages that were less paternalistic, when we explored them in the focus groups, men turned pretty paternalistic and pretty anti-women too, actually. Pretty derogatory, which I guess is not new to many people in the room. So yeah, something we really need to work on, and I don't think we have the answer. Last quick question, Kim.
Thanks, Celinda. You know, everybody in the room knows how critical funding is, and we keep working towards coming up with the right messages on
Yeah.
that. And considering the tax sensitivity, one of the things that I've been talking about is not being smart about where we put our tax dollars. And I've gotten some good reaction on the issue of putting billions of dollars into building more prisons and having more prison beds, where if we had more shelter beds, we'd have fewer homicides and fewer people in prison, and just being smart about spending our tax dollars rather than say, give us more tax dollars. Do you think that would deal with the tax
So with the
sensitivity?
public, probably not so much so, but with the legislators, yes. And we're very, I mean, as you know, Kim, and others here know, there has been a sea change in terms of the criminal justice movement, and we're working with Soros Foundation of Public Welfare. And we've been getting a hearing in a lot of state legislatures about a whole shift in criminal justice, because the state legislators are there. Because the price of these prisons is just so great. So interesting. I don't know how well it would work, because people are responding more to the values than the transaction. But for state legislators, that might be a very good argument, and certainly a great thing to produce studies for at your state level to take into the state legislature. So thank you all for all that you do, and thank you for your wonderful input, and look forward to working with you more.